Hello, my name is Chelley Gutin, and I'm going to read a humorous passage from a book called Let Me Count the Ways, written by Peter DeVries and published in 1965, which is the first time I read this book and found it very amusing. Peter DeVries is well known for writing amusing novels about everyday people. This book is about a man whose name is Stanley Waltz. He's Polish-American, and when he meets you for the first time, he's likely to tell you that his name was most likely shortened from a name like Walensky or Wolowitz or something like that. By profession, he's a piano mover, and he's not highly educated, but he is intelligent, and he is pretty well spoken, although he's not very polished. We pick up the story after he's coming home from an evening out with his buddies at Frank's Tavern, where they've been discussing news articles recently that in their town there have been reports of prowlers, and so that's on his mind. I always came home from Frank's place through the alley. I closed the gate behind me and had just passed the garage and was walking across the yard toward the back steps when a noise in my bedroom made me stop. It was just the scrape of a chair, but there was something so secret and mysterious about it that I stole over and stood quietly under the window. The shade was almost, but not quite, drawn. By taking a step back and standing on tiptoe, I could just look under it into the lighted room. Elsie had just undressed and was standing at the foot of the bed, ready to get into her nightgown. As I watched, she slipped it over her head and wriggled into it with her arms in the air. It was a charming feminine motion, and supposedly done every night at this time, and often in my presence. But did I ever notice it? Had I ever? Watching her when she didn't know she was being watched, least of all, of course, from out here, that was what gave the scene an extra flavor. In fact, there was an odd thrill about it, a dash of secret excitement, quite unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It remained with me after I locked up the house and had gone to bed myself, causing me to take Elsie in my arms in a way that, I guess, I hadn't done in some time. I slept a little better than I had in some time, too, and without getting up for any extra nightcaps. The next night, about 10:30, I was stretched out in bed with my clothes on, looking at a so-called art magazine, when I glanced up to find Elsie sitting at the dresser in her shift, brushing her hair. Funny, I thought, here a man will pore over cheesecake when the real-life article is in the same room with him. All he has to do is lift his eyes from the page, and there's the substance. But no, he prefers to feast his eyes on the shadow. I remembered my little adventure of last night and had a whim to repeat it. I got up, putting the magazine aside. I hovered around for a minute, giving the drawn window shade a slight hitch up so it would clear the sill, and said something about going outside for a breath of air before locking up. I drifted down the porch steps into the yard and resumed my post under the window. She was in profile to me this time, but the effect, if anything, was that much more provocative. Her pink slip fell away above her crossed legs, offering a tantalizing glimpse of plump white thigh. She was slow in undressing, and I noticed for the first time, appreciated a certain thoughtful leisure in the way she did things when she was by herself. She may have been haphazard in the way she put her hair up, but not in the slow, methodical way she brushed it. She seemed to enjoy that. Eternal, charming, feminine sight. I crouched there in the shadows, watching for fully 15 minutes before being rewarded with the crowning sight. She stepped out of her underthings, as women do, put her nightgown over her head, and then there was the same delightful wriggle as the silk slipped down her flanks and settled on folds about her with a secret whisper I fancied I could hear out here. I couldn't wait to get back to her. It was only afterwards that I got up again and locked the house. This went on for several nights. Sometimes I would go out when I knew the charming performance was about to begin. Sometimes I would lurk around the backyard without knowing, adding a tingle of uncertainty to it. I would just look around, wander across the fence, looking idly at the view across the alley. A number of shades were up. I saw from 2 or 3 windows how careless people can be. But that was not what I was out here for, and I would turn away. Old Mrs. Stepanak could be seen ironing in the kitchen in her slip, not a sight to detain anybody for long. Once she put her iron down and went to the window to lean out of it, spreading her hands on the sill for a look around. When she withdrew, she pulled the shade down. No need for any such precautions, Mrs. Stepanak, I thought sympathetically. I pursued my newfound fancy for the better part of 3 weeks, I would say. Not regularly by any means, that is to say, not nightly, but when the mood took me. And while I cannot recommend this rather sophisticated practice indiscriminately and without regard for the individual temperaments concerned, it did add a certain zest to my own domestic life. It's a taste for special palates, an extra fillip for jaded sensibilities. One night, about 10:30, I was crouched in the shadows at my customary observation post when there was a rustle of footsteps behind me and a hand gripped my shoulder. I saw the glimmer of a badge and a cop's face, accompanied on the other side by another. All right, that's about enough of that, don't you think? What do you mean? I asked, as I was hustled away between them through the alley gate and then toward a squad car parked some distance down with the motor off and the headlights out. What's the meaning of this? Oh, cut it. Let's not play games. You don't understand, I said. I live there. That's my house. Then what were you doing looking into it like that? None of your beeswax. I was helped into the back seat and joined by one of the cops while the other got in behind the wheel and drove off. You'll have to do better than that, Mac, the driver threw over his shoulder as we turned onto the street. We're cracking down on altogether too many prowlers lately. I don't know what it is. The weather, sunspots, world tensions, or just a run of something you get now and then for no reason you can explain. What's your name? Stanley Waltz. Got any identification? My wallet was in my coat, which I didn't have on, so the answer to that was negative. But if you'll drive me back, I'll get it and show you. Where do you live? There, I pointed, back in the direction we had come, and with considerable spirit, for I was getting my dander up. I lived there. That was my backyard. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Then why were you acting so suspicious? I was only doing what I had a perfect right to do. It's my property, and I'll prowl on it all I want, and I'll act as suspicious on it as I goddamn please, and you'll learn to your regret that that's that. I said it with heat, for we were slowing to a stop in front of the 3rd Precinct station. Who reported this? I don't know. We just got the call on the shortwave. Mrs. Stepanak, because she don't have to worry about anybody will bother her. Much has been written about the subject of reality and illusion, and how the two merge into one in an individual's life. I wouldn't know what to call this as I was escorted up the station stairs. They were real enough, and so is the broad doorway through which we walked. Yet the whole thing was a fantasy. The main desk was on a raised platform behind a massive wooden rail that would give anybody up to it, even somebody lodging a complaint, the feeling of a wretch before a high tribunal. A Sergeant Michelson was on duty, according to a nameplate on the desk, which had a shortwave mic on it and a mess of papers that he had been working on. 2 smaller desks behind him were unoccupied at the moment, though in the course of the next few minutes, a sleepy-looking cop entered from a back door and sat down at one of them. The cops who were running me in steered me up to the main desk. "Charge?" asked the sergeant. "Peeper." The sergeant gave me a glance before pulling a form sheet toward him, murmuring something like, "At last." By now, I had hit on my plan. "That was what I had gone out to look for, Your Honor," I said. "I thought I heard a noise outside, and it was in all likelihood him, since there was this call reporting him. So I stepped outside to check, but I saw nothing. He had apparently escaped." "You didn't look as though you were seeing nothing in that window," the cop who had been driving said. I now recognized him as a blond Polak I had seen around town. "You looked as though you were seeing plenty and getting your fill. We watched you ourselves for a couple of minutes to make sure. You weren't looking for any prowler. You were watching a show." "It was my own house, which I understand is a man's castle. That includes the grounds, I take it?" "What were you watching?" the desk sergeant put in. "I was watching my missus prepare to retire for the night." "Couldn't you do that from inside?" "It's not the same thing." "I see." He stroked his chin in a way that indicated he didn't exactly, but was trying to. "Do you make a regular practice of this?" "I don't see that my private life is any concern of this department." "You may be disturbing the peace in some way." "You're disturbing the peace. I'll make this a test case in any court you care to name, and I may also sue you for false arrest if you don't stop this nonsense and let me go." Losing my temper was all to the good, since it indicated that I was telling the truth, at least to the desk sergeant's satisfaction. It was to him that I addressed my plan. When he asked for my identification, I told him that it was at home, and then gave him my name, address, and telephone number, and suggested a simple call would clear this all up. "Doesn't 922 Sparrow Street sound like the number of the house where you picked me up?" I asked, turning to the driver of the car. He allowed that it did. The other cop had disappeared, but a man in plain clothes had joined the group, taking notes of his own. His interest seemed to me sympathetic and intelligent as he listened to the questions and answers. I now proposed to the desk sergeant that he check the phone number I reeled off to him against the name and address I gave him by consulting the directory on his desk. He did, and they tallied, of course. Now, why don't you call my house and ask the lady who answers to give you a description of me?" That was how it was all straightened out. The Mrs. Stanley Waltz who answered said it was true. Her husband had stepped out of the house for a minute and had not been seen since. She described me, a square-jawed man of 40, with dark eyes and kinky black hair parted on the left, and calloused hands. But what he was wearing when last seen, she couldn't say for the life of her, showing that we never look at one another. A few questions about our private lives, such as her maiden name, etc., and a comparison of her answers with mine, satisfied the desk sergeant, who then told her she could come and get me any time. But he didn't dismiss me immediately. After he had hung up, he lit a cigar stub that had gone out. He watched me through the flame as he puffed to get it going. The man in plain clothes was still jotting his notes when I turned away and started down toward a bench on which to sit down and wait. "Just a minute," the desk sergeant said. "I'd like to ask you a few more questions, personally." "What do you want to know?" "How long have you been married?" 12 years. "Have you been engaging in this practice for long?" "I've said that seems to be none of your business." "Well now, just wait a second. I could make it my business. I'm only asking these things personally, not as an officer of the law. But I'm not sure your behavior isn't a violation of some statute or another." "Not at all sure. I can still book you if you're not cooperative and put bail at $500, which you probably can't scare up in cash at this hour of the night. So why don't you just try to satisfy the law's justifiable curiosity?" "Am I to understand that you use your job as a cloak for peering into other people's emotional windows?" "He's got you there, Sarge," said the man in plain clothes, moving in a little closer with his notebook and pencil. I figured he was making the full report, and since he had such a friendly face and manner, I decided to go along with him. He was a young man of about 35, with a lean ferret face, but twinkling blue eyes that you instinctively trusted. The diplomatic thing would clearly be to go along with him as a means of smoothing the whole matter out on an amicable basis. "You accuse the sergeant, then, of morbid curiosity?" he asked, with an extra sparkle in his eye. "I wouldn't accuse him of anything. I just raised the point. I'm only trying to grasp his exact motivation," the sergeant said to him, and then to me. "What exactly do you feel when you steal outside and watch your wife under these conditions, instead of inside the house where you're perfectly free to feast your eyes on her to your heart's content?" "She's my lawfully wedded spouse, and I have a right to look at her any way I wish." "Do you pretend she's a stranger or something? That you've never seen her before? Or that you don't live there, but it's somebody else's house and somebody else's wife? Or what?" "I've never thought it through in any such detail. All I can tell you is, well, it puts a woman in a new light, gives her a new dimension. Spices up a relationship, hops up the domestic grind," the sergeant said, nodding to himself. "Yes, I can see that. Gives an old and familiar dish a dash of the garlic of the forbidden," the other man said. He was evidently the intellectual of the bunch. Would you say that there's that in it? I mean, that part of the thrill is the pleasure of the forbidden, pretending that you're an evildoer? I've told you I don't analyze it that deep. I just don't go into it. If you want to, go ahead, but leave me out of it. You're parlaying a little thing into something it was never intended. My original defense still stands. I was picked up for skulking around private property, but it's my property, and I'll skulk around on it all I goddamn please. It's my right under the Constitution. But what if everybody did that? The sergeant asked. What if this became a universal habit, and all the backyards in town were full of husbands peering at their wives through the bedroom window to give them an extra new dimension? Where would civilization as we know it be then? I have no idea, and it wouldn't be my problem in any case. If you'll excuse me, I'll go outside and wait for my wife. I don't want her in a place like this. Have you ever been psychoanalyzed? The guy in plain clothes asked, following me. Not yet, I said, going out the door, but you may drive me to it. Do you care to amplify your statement about a new dimension? Define that more closely. No. I was waiting for Elsie at the curb when she drew up, a few minutes later. I hopped in and told her to step on it. She accepted without any questions my explanation that I had gone out to check on a noise in the yard, not saying anything to her about it because I didn't want to frighten her unnecessarily. Well, I'm glad the police department is efficient in some ways, she said, even though they nabbed the wrong person. I may sue them for false arrest, I said, not really meaning it, but just to get it off my chest. No, don't, Stan. Forget it. Just stay in the house nights after this. It'll keep you out of trouble. As it turned out, I stayed in not only nights but days as well for some time to come, because while my explanation held water on the domestic front, there was a story on page 5 of the Slow Rapids Blade the next day. The young fellow in plain clothes with the trustworthy eyes taking all those notes was a reporter, as you may have guessed. That I never tumbled is indicative of my state of mind at the time. The story wasn't featured or played up in any way, and thank God not on page 1, but it was long and detailed and followed by opinions of my behavior from local leading authorities. The reporter had got right on the blower and asked lawyers and judges and psychologists to give their views on exactly what constitutes disturbing the peace and just how far a man's privileges go on his own property, and to what extent, in other words, a man's home is his castle. The head of the psychology department at the local college, Polycarp, gave his slant on my behavior. I would say there's nothing morbid in this practice, his statement ran. Not seriously so, at any rate, except to the degree that it may be a kind of fetishism. Although here too we must proceed cautiously. Fetishism, classically defined, is the compulsive use of some inanimate object in attaining sexual gratification, such as a shoe, a lock of hair, an undergarment, etc. Here, the object is not any of these, but the naked body, which can, of course, be associated with sexuality. Perhaps new ground is being broken here, or should be broken, in our continuing attempt to understand the whole complicated mechanism of special detail in sexual gratification. Simultaneously, there is another and contrary element to be taken into consideration. In obtaining sight of the sexual object under simulated, surreptitious circumstances such as these, there is doubtless at work to the degradation principle. There is doubtless also at work the degradation principle, that of making a member of an alliance a temporarily anonymous object, and so reducing her in status, a form of violation in itself. Even more cardinally, perhaps, is the wish to divest her of familiarity as such. The husband simultaneously converts her into the stranger. This may be the beginning of a trend. A woman in Pennsylvania was recently granted a divorce on the ground that her husband insisted on giving her a new name each week. These attempts to freshen up a familiar object, even confer a new identity by imposing novelty it does not intrinsically possess, is a reversal of the usual functions of fantasy. Instead of living in an imaginary world, one makes the real world imaginary. But it remains to be seen whether any new ground is really being broken here, whether the incident cited are straws in the wind. Certainly, a close watch should be kept to ascertain whether a trend is in the making. Thank you.